Hi James, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. As you know, we're hosting our very first ESG conference for all of our suppliers, and you've been working with the DFS Group now for a little while. Could you start by just telling us a little bit more about your background and what you do as an advisor and advocate on climate change?
Yes, I am an advocate. I'm a barrister by training. I always taught law as well as practiced. Was always interested in the connection between theory and practice. And I've also been a sort of serial entrepreneur, creating organisations, always with the help of others. Each of them in their turn with some kind of mission or purpose. Starting off in the law with the Centre for International Environmental Law, which is still going strong in Washington, but also going into finance, initially through the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and then Climate Change Capital, which was a pioneer organization that did exactly what it said. It channeled capital into the solutions to climate change. And now I sort of combine the advocacy with governance, being on boards or advising leaders, with some empathy for how difficult it is, because I make decisions too. So I know that decision making is hard, and it's particularly hard with a complex problem like climate change.
And you're closely involved with COP26. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I've spent just over 30 years working on the climate change issue. The first piece of work that I ever did as a barrister, as a professor, I suppose, initially it was an academic piece of work, was for Greenpeace on whether you could bring a case to the International Court of Justice against the United States of America for failure to act on climate change. And it was in 1988. And there was evidence then, and plenty of it, that there was a need to act. And I thought that the best advice I could give Greenpeace and others was to not pursue litigation in that form, because the US wouldn't submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court, but to negotiate an international treaty. And so with the help of others, I raised some money from the Ford Foundation, and we imagined what an international treaty on climate change would look like, and then who would most benefit from our work, which countries, which peoples would be most in need of an international treaty, and obviously those were the most vulnerable. And the small island states around the world stood out as countries and peoples who were most vulnerable to climate change and least able to look after their own interests without the law being of some equalizing benefit to them. So that led to advocacy for international agreement on their behalf, and then years of negotiating on their behalf in those negotiations. In Rio in '92, in Kyoto in 1997, in Paris in 2015. And then since then, I've advised the presidents of a number of the annual Conference of the Parties. Every year there's a president. So I advised Peru and Morocco and Fiji, and now the UK is president of the process, culminating this year, having been delayed a year, with an event which we hope will be as real as it can be in Glasgow at the end of the year. So I'm what's called a friend of COP26. I don't actually sit in government to do this, but advise government in their role as president of this process. And there are others doing it too, and it's a very good group. But it's a big year.
And what do you think are the kind of things that we can see coming out of COP26? And obviously in Paris, we've got the Paris Protocol Agreement. Are we expecting something the same this year?
The Paris Agreement needs updating. It was designed into the Paris Agreement. There'd be a sort of ratcheting up of obligation, that there would be raised ambition from those governments who had submitted their climate plans, their nationally determined contributions, they're called. And so this is a year for governments to present updated, more ambitious plans, which obviously get converted into law and policy. They're supposed to be a kind of commitment to the world to deliver the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but made relevant by access to the latest science. And we know that we're quite a long way off track from our objectives of stabilizing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and reducing our emissions to such a state that we avoid the worst consequences of climate change, and we are not winning that particular struggle at the moment. But these commitments will help. And this year, the UK government has chosen some themes which I think the audience would find, interesting and accessible: finance, nature, energy transition, adaptation and resilience, which is really all about coping with the physical consequences of climate change. And those themes, as they always are a combination of work that needs to be done by governments, but work that can be done by all other actors in our society: businesses, investors, civil society organizations. And these processes, these COPs at the end of each year, are designed to draw in all of those who can help deliver on the mandates that governments set for themselves. And so there's always some trade fair element, some sort of feeling of collaboration. Often what goes on around the negotiations is more interesting and compelling, maybe have more immediate influence on a corporate decision than the intergovernmental process. Although I have to say that every now and again, when the process starts to get a harder legal edge, then decision makers in companies know that the rules of the game are going to change, and then they pay attention.
So with the new Biden administration coming in, they've brought in a Green New Deal and lots of very exciting eco initiatives. What do you think this means for the wider business context, and how might this translate for our suppliers?
Well, the new administration in the US is a huge shift in first of all, in the way governments will perceive their role in dealing with climate change. It's been an excuse for some governments over the years. That's what's the US doing? It's either what's China doing or what's the US doing. And now that we've had the change of administration, some appointments of really good people who know about the climate change issue. You've got sort of long career commitments to solving the problem. Appointments like John Kerry in the diplomatic role that he now has, which has already been hugely influential on our own government. You will have noticed how much climate change features in the way we want to present ourselves in the world now, both in a foreign policy sense, but also in the way we build relationships with other governments, including the United States of America. It's also the case that some people who have gone into the administration have experience in finance. It's noticeable that Brian Dees went from BlackRock into the White House. You've got people who are very knowledgeable about how finance works in renewable energy going into the White House. These people are going to be in positions of responsibility for the next 4 years, and they mean to act. And as a result, you can sense that that the US, together with China, Korea, Japan, the EU and the UK, if all of those countries start to align their public policy commitments on climate change, if all of them start to use their COVID recovery funds, the stimulus packages, to do more on sustainable infrastructure, then capital will start to flow in a different direction. And if you add that to the movement in finance around ESG ratings, ESG data collection and comparison, a lot of moving parts there, a lot of contest over what the right measurements are. But on the whole, it's becoming central to the way finance works, which in turn means that if you have the capacity to meet those standards and satisfy investors that you can, you're more likely to attract investment. And this is a very significant shift, providing huge opportunity for those who do have solutions or who can manage their businesses in a way where, if you like, knowledge of this problem and your capacity to deal with it is a proxy for good management. And one of the things we're seeing already is that large funds are starting to recalibrate who they should invest in because of their capacity to deal with these problems, who has got the solutions. And that is creating a very attractive environment for investment for those who can bring their solutions into key supply chains like this one.
So do you anticipate there will be any legislation changes or financial changes that would necessarily apply to our supply chain?
Of course, always. I mean, what happens is that there will be Paul Polman, for example, who ex-CEO of Unilever. He'll be leading a whole group of companies who will be making commitments on how they manage their supply chains. The French were very good when they hosted COP. They really did understand well that they needed the support of the non-state actors, so-called, the civil society organizations, businesses, investors, the people who weren't actually negotiating a treaty, but upon whose resources the implementation of a treaty would depend. And everybody realizes that this problem is so huge, so complex, involving every aspect of our economy and society, that governments alone, important though they are, central though they are, can't do all of the work that is required to make us safe and prosperous, given the physical consequences of climate change, the hard facts of climate change. And so the French developed a kind of split between the formal negotiations and everything else that goes on, and they created a climate champion role, which this year is being done by a guy called Nigel Topping, who used to be at CDP, so I've known him for a long time. And he's very good at coalition building. He did that through the We Mean Business Coalition. And there will be several of these efforts to organize businesses and investors around targets which they set for themselves. There's a thing called Race to Zero, which is those companies that have set net zero targets. And of course, once somebody in the supply chain, particularly if there's somebody with a lot of power in the supply chain, sets targets that they expect to be implemented by their suppliers and will use their private contractual authority to require that of suppliers, well, then the rules of the game change for all of those who are in that supply chain. And these days, it's much easier to measure and monitor and find ways of tracking whether someone, for example, has managed to reduce the overall carbon footprint of a company. And so that you can expect a lot of announcements and a lot of commitments made through the process this year that will affect the way supply chains work. That's before you get to anything that has been set as a target by a government that will be translated into law and policy. And you'll get that too.
So I'm sure you're aware that obviously DFS Group have made that commitment. We're on the race to net zero by 2040. So what advice would you give DFS Group and all of our suppliers on this journey? Because it's not a small undertaking to try and get to net zero.
No, it really isn't. What is attractive in these difficult circumstances is the capacity that we all have to innovate under pressure. We are adaptable, creative, and on the whole, more than capable as a species of coping with threat. Ask any artist, ask any engineer. There is a relationship between constraint and creativity. They go together. If you ask an engineer to fix a problem, and even skew it so that they're scarce resources or give them all sorts of challenges, they rise to it. They like that challenge. It's something that is alluring. An artist is constrained by form, but always pushing at the edges, wanting to find ways of delivering something imaginative and distinct and creative, despite the fact that we're always limited in part by what has gone before. So this period of time where we absolutely have to work with hard physical constraints in the natural environment, in the atmosphere itself, the atmospheric chemistry is not a forgiving thing. And but our social, political, and economic affairs are more flexible and malleable, and we can make them. We can transform ourselves in the face of a threat that is of our own making. And in a sense, it's obvious once you understand that the problem is caused by us in many ways, and it's clear that it's capable of being resolved by us in many ways across so many decisions made every day. And I find that an optimistic prospect rather than one that induces fear. So I think the harsh truth is that there is no option but to deal directly with the real world fact of climate change. But we have many examples of attractive solutions to climate change that bring other benefits, either in the form of greater efficiency or learning to collaborate more effectively, finding common interests between people in very different parts of the world. And actually some of the solutions that we know about already produce benefits in quality of life terms, cleaner air, a natural environment that is valued is a natural environment that human beings will thrive in. So yes, there's huge complexity, and sometimes time pressure feels hard to cope with. It's harder sometimes to lead when others aren't doing the same, and so you feel like it might be easier to follow. But in truth, there aren't any hiding places from this particular problem.
So our approach to transparency and traceability, you think, is the right way forward as an initial starting point for the DFS Group?
Yes, I mean, in almost every circumstance, the interventions that we need to make have to produce greater learning, because we don't have all the answers. We have a lot that are visible. There's a lot that we know how to do now that will be transformative. I mean, we can see it most obviously in our power systems, where the prospect of decarbonizing or removing fossil fuels from the generation of power is in sight. It's achievable within a generation, and that's happened relatively fast. We've managed to go from roughly 70% coal in our power system in the UK to most days it's barely measurable. It's probably at most 2% during the course of a year, and the lights didn't go off. And the ways in which we generate power now produce all sorts of other benefits: security of supply, security risks associated with supply if you're not having to import fossil fuels from somewhere else. But let's face it, light is abundant and it's available anywhere on the planet. There are huge geopolitical consequences, and they are mostly good, from the switch to clean energy. There are much better ways of managing material waste in an economy, and nobody should be impressed at our capacity so far to manage waste. We are outrageously and embarrassingly wasteful. But then, when you really pay attention to these systems, you find ways to innovate and make production process better, just produce better results from the way in which you connect materials to production process to consumption. And I'm really very optimistic about what has been done already in DFS. I love the developments that have happened so far, and there's more to come. So, in the end, it is a question of leadership. If you set a direction and you're serious, and the people who work with you and work for you and work alongside you know you're serious, you will innovate, you'll produce solutions. And sometimes it's a question of convincing those who either finance you or who in some way provide public policy incentives that these changes can be made permanent, and you can carry on. You can make the next innovation, and eventually, little by little, problem gets solved.
We'll get there together. Oh, thank you very much, James. As always, it's been amazingly insightful chatting with you. Thank you very much for your time.
A pleasure.